When Victoria chose to accompany her husband on a trip to the jungle, she never thought she would feel so scared in front of a gorilla. But what the gorilla did to her shocked the whole world and forever changed her perspective on these animals. Victoria's heart quickened with anticipation as she stepped onto the rugged terrain of Peck Plateau National Park. The air was thick with the excitement of a once-in-a-lifetime experience, meeting Jalta and EMA, two young male gorillas who had been released into the wild 4 years prior. The release operation had been sponsored by the Aspen Foundation, and as the wife of its chairman, Damien, she had been given the unique opportunity to be one of a few people selected to travel to Gabon to witness this meeting. Damien knew both gorillas personally and had told her he wanted to introduce her to them before saying goodbye forever. Jalta and EMA had been raised by Damien himself within a sanctuary, and while they had a good life there, they had been selected to be released into the wild within the relative safety of the national park in 2003. Now, 4 years later, Damien was taking advantage of another trip to Central Africa to check on his friends. Upon arriving in Gabon, Victoria and Damien were met by rangers from Peck Plateau. As they piled into boats, the rangers briefed them on the way to the park and listed some safety precautions regarding the gorilla release. At this point, Victoria began to feel nervous. While it may be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see gorillas in the wild, the animals could also be very unpredictable and dangerous. Victoria knew that many people misunderstood gorillas and thought them to be wild and aggressive when, in reality, they were just gentle giants. However, Jalta and EMA were not expecting to meet a group of humans on their daily patrol of the forest, and this situation could be unnerving for them if they felt threatened in any way. Then they could attack. Damien seemed convinced they would never hurt him and, by extension, her, but she was feeling a little uneasy. As the boats entered the national park, Victoria felt a whole host of emotions ranging from excitement, disbelief, and anxiety. As the boats came to a halt and the rangers helped them down, it was clear from looking around that she wasn't the only one to feel this way. The park authorities instructed her to remain as still as possible. When the two gorillas appeared in the clearing, they needed to get used to their presence first. If any of them made a sudden movement before they were ready to approach, things could go very, very wrong. The group gently sat down amongst the tall grass, eagerly awaiting the moment they had all traveled here for. Nothing but animal cries could be heard as no one in the group dared to make a noise. And suddenly, Victoria became aware of something sniffing and grunting, teamed with the swishing of the tall grass. The gorillas were coming. As if to read her mind, the park ranger in charge of Victoria's group nodded, confirming that Jalta and EMA would soon be joining them. Everyone in the group seemed to collectively hold their breath as two looming figures suddenly seemed to burst through the dense overgrowth. Victoria's mind was racing. She had never felt so scared and awestruck at the same time. Jalta and EMA were even more magnificent than she had imagined. The two gorillas immediately spotted Victoria's group and began to make grunting noises that did nothing to halt the beads of sweat that were now running down her back. EMA seemed to be the leader and was the first one to approach, with Jalta hanging back behind him. He sniffed around the group and then wandered away as if giving his approval for them to stay. Jalta cautiously looked on, still unsure of the situation. There was something about the way he kept glancing at her that made Victoria feel uncomfortable. He would look over, then grunt and bare his teeth, and although he never came close, it was still enough to instill fear into Victoria. Damien spoke to them with soothing words, hoping they'd recognize his voice and come closer, but the male gorillas didn't seem interested. So after a few hours, the group boarded the boats again and left for the safety and comfort of their lodging. The following day, as the group returned to the park for another day with the gorillas, Victoria couldn't shake the sense of dread she'd felt. She had wanted to do this trip more than anything in the world, but it wasn't going as she had expected. She was so grateful that she'd seen Jalta and EMA in the wild, but while EMA seemed dismissive of the group, Jalta seemed to harbor some suspicion against them. Victoria couldn't stop thinking about the way the gorilla had looked at her and was getting more uneasy by the minute. She was secretly hoping that if they'd encounter the gorillas again, then they would only see EMA. She didn't think she could face Jalta again. Taking up a spot further into the overgrowth, the group settled down and waited. The park rangers that accompanied them had seemed eager for them to have more interaction with the gorillas, especially since they knew how close the two males had been with Damien up to 4 years earlier. They hoped Jalta and EMA would spend more time around them today now that they knew them. Victoria felt like the odd one out, not really wanting to be there anymore, but soon enough, she heard the familiar noises that signaled that at least one of the gorillas was close by. Victoria felt like her heart was going to pound out of her chest. In a burst of grunts and groans, Iane emerged from the foliage, his movements hesitant but curious. Victoria almost let out a sigh of relief, seeing that Iane had come on his own. Maybe the day wouldn't be so bad after all, she thought, feeling a little braver than the previous day. Iane made his way over to the small group. The ranger had been right. It seemed as though Iane remembered them and was keen to introduce himself again. He sniffed around everyone and cautiously had a look under their bags, which caused a few giggles to erupt from the group. And this time when Damien spoke, he listened intently, finally recognizing the voice of the man who had raised him as a baby. Before long, though, he seemed to grow bored of his new visitors and wandered off to lay down. Luckily, the group could still see him as he indulged in an afternoon nap. Smiling at how peaceful Iame looked laid out on his back, Victoria felt grateful that today the trip seemed to be living up to her expectations. It helped that Jalta wasn't around either. Watching the sleeping Iame seemed to relax Victoria, and she felt her shoulders drop from the tense position they seemed to have been in all day. But then she caught a dark spot moving out of the corner of her eye. Jalta was lurking amongst the trees. Everyone else in the group seemed to have their spirits lifted with the arrival of the second gorilla, but Victoria's stomach was in knots. The day before, Jalta hadn't seemed as brave as Ema and chose to follow the other gorilla's lead. Today, though, he seemed different, and that terrified her even more. He emerged from the trees and rose up on his back legs in order to take in the scene before him. The sheer size of him sent a shiver down Victoria's spine, a harsh contrast to the hot sweat she'd broken out in. Not knowing whether it was best to look away and attempt to regulate her breathing or to keep her eyes on Jalta so she knew where he was, Victoria stood as still as possible. Damien was enthralled by the gorilla, but she realized she was completely terrified of him. And suddenly, Jalta turned and fixed his eyes on her, grunting and staring right at her. Then he dropped back down onto four legs and began walking towards the group. The caution he'd exercised the day before was gone. This time, he was determined to meet the people who seemed so interested in him. His grunts accelerated as he approached, and Victoria felt like the world was closing in on her. Subconsciously, she had closed her eyes as Jalta advanced, but now she could feel his hot breath inches from her face. His grunts were low and quiet. Victoria forced herself to open her eyes and found herself looking straight into the muddy pools of the gorilla's eyes. Then she noticed his expression change, and her heart dropped quick as a flash. Jalta grabbed hold of her hand, and she sensed gasps coming from the others in the group. From the corner of her eye, she could see Damien inch forward. He was speaking to the gorilla in a low voice, hoping he would recognize him just as Ema had done. However, everything around her seemed to be a muffled blur. She couldn't even make out the words her husband was whispering. Unbeknownst to her, he was introducing her as his wife. The gorilla stared intensely into Victoria's eyes, not letting go of her hand, not breaking eye contact. Jalta sat down in front of her, and she suddenly felt her whole world change. Victoria now sensed the park ranger on the outskirts of her view in hushed tones. He explained that Jalta's grunts were an attempt at communication. Victoria somehow already knew what she had to do, though. Allowing Jalta to keep hold of the hand he grabbed, she slowly raised her other arm up, making sure the gorilla could see what she was doing. Terrified but compelled to carry out her action by something she'd seen in Jalta's eyes, she cautiously wrapped her free arm around the huge creature. The group watched in shock at what the gorilla did next. Jalta sank his huge frame into Victoria's body and wrapped his arms around her, still cradling her hand in his. All the fear Victoria had felt melted away as she felt the gorilla's gentle breath against her. Jalta had never wanted to hurt her. He just needed someone to love him. Throughout the day, Jalta became Victoria's companion. He allowed her to stroke his head, and in return, he groomed her hair. He never once left her side. Jalta had no interest in the rest of the group, and the park ranger marveled at how quickly the gorilla had formed a bond with Victoria. He allowed her to lay against him and touch his fur, held her hand, and played with her fingers as though it reassured him. As Victoria lay nestled into his fur, she reflected on how the experience had gone above and beyond anything she could ever imagine. As if the group couldn't be in any more shock over what they were witnessing, Jalta decided to give them one last display of his personality. He snatched Victoria's baseball cap from her head and paraded around with it perched backward on his head. The sight drew immense laughter from the group. Even the park rangers couldn't believe that Jalta had gone from the cautious, foreboding figure to a lovable prankster in such a short space of time. The way Jalta was wearing the cap was the confirmation Victoria needed that gorillas are extremely intelligent animals. He had noticed her pulling it over her head and was now mimicking her actions with surprising decision. He was reacting with interest and curiosity to both her and Damien's voices, showing them he still remembered the man who had once raised him and that he recognized her as part of his family. She was a friend of his friend and therefore a friend of his. As the day drew to a close, Victoria reflected on how she had started her day with a sense of dread hanging over her. Now, her heart was breaking over the thought of leaving Jalta. As if sensing her sadness when it was time to go, the gorilla cupped her face in his giant hands and leaned in towards her. The pair sat forehead to forehead in a moment of true connection. Then Victoria lifted her head up and planted a small kiss on Jalta's nose, eliciting a soft grunt. She wished she could explain to Jalta how much she had changed her life, but with one last look into those warm, loving eyes, she got the feeling he felt the same way. Luckily for Victoria, the park rangers had captured clips of her with Jalta throughout the day and asked her if he could upload them to YouTube as promotion for the park. Victoria agreed, feeling grateful for having a video she would always be able to look back on. Yet, she didn't expect the clip to shock people around the world. Victoria's video ended up going viral, with many people admitting they felt shocked at the way Jalta had bonded with her. It highlighted the wonderful work the national park did in reintroducing animals to the wild and broke down people's misconceptions about gorillas. Many people expressed they had thought gorillas to be violent and dangerous, but Jalta had shown the world that he was a gentle creature deserving of love. As the group left the park one last time, Victoria thought back to when the trip had started. She'd been expecting amazing things, but her extraordinary encounter with Jalta almost felt unbelievable. To say her life had changed felt like an understatement. Now it's over to you. What do you think about Victoria and Jalta's bond? How would you have felt in that situation?